Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Today we are going to talk about Action Park. I had mentioned before that I was going to start doing a series on abandoned or strange places, and this is one of them. It's a park that was abandoned for a while, but now they want to reopen it. We're going to look at the reasons why it was abandoned, why it failed, and why it's also considered one of the most dangerous parks in the world. So, here on the screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Down below, you have my social networks if you want to follow me on any of them. So without further ado, let's get started. This park was created by Gene Mulvihill. At that time, he was an employee of an insurance company selling stocks on the stock market in a somewhat dishonest way. Due to the amount of sales he had by doing this and how he managed, Gene ended up being the director of this same company. Unfortunately for him, what he did and how he did it resulted in a big scandal, which got him fired from the company. And at that moment, he did what any normal person would do, which is to buy 2 large ski resorts. He decided that the best thing he could do was to invest in these kinds of places, and why? Because in Vernon, there supposedly was a great tourist future. Jim began to see other investors putting money into this place, so he wanted to do the same. He thought it was the next favorite place in the world for tourists, so he wanted to stand out. His ski resort at that time had nothing flashy, so to stand out, he decided to build a giant snow machine. And what did he use? An airplane turbine. It turned out to be the largest snow machine in the world. So it did bring him attention, but there was still a problem, and that is that even with that snow machine, a few months of the year he was not going to have any kind of business because in the warm months there simply was no snow or it melted almost instantly. So he starts building summer games on another part of his land. One of the first things he did was games that had to do with water, like giant water-powered slides, lake jumps, bumper boats, everything he could imagine he did. And I mean this very seriously about imagining. Anything he imagined went straight to the park. That is, there was no safety control in the middle of whether something was going to work or not. He simply did it, and if it worked, perfect. And if it worked halfway well, it was used anyway. All these games that I'm going to mention had nothing to do with any engineer. At no time did they call any expert in physical calculations. They never thought it through. And the biggest problem was precisely that Jin and his colleagues were not focused on security, but rather on everything new, everything flashy, everything that would give them more money. Therefore, they really didn't care. Water parks at that time either did not exist or were not known. Thus, there was nowhere to draw an example from. So they started to build different things that looked attractive, each time faster and higher, which would impress people a lot. I can tell you that the only attraction that didn't really cause problems in the park, that didn't have any kind of injuries as far as I know, is the little train that went around all the attractions. So I think you can imagine where we're going with all of this. That was possibly the only reliable thing in the park. By 1978, there were enough games to call it Action Park, and so it was born. It was a place that promoted itself by giving guests an extreme experience. It also promoted the fact that guests could control how extreme the experience was. There were games where the person could control how fast or slow they went, even if the path did not look reliable and it was recommended not to go faster. Still, guests could do whatever they wanted. These ideas, of course, turned out to be quite dangerous. The park was split into 3 parts. Alpine Center, which had its slide, Alpine. Water World, a wonderful place full of water games. And Motor World, which was all about engines and things of that style like boats, cars, tanks. We are going to go into detail about that last thing. I think one of the biggest and most intriguing attractions, which was also like a legend when people entered the park because they didn't know if it existed or not, was the Cannonball Loop, which is this big water slide with a loop at the end, a turn that people had to go through. There were many problems with this, many. First of all, the invention of this slide started with Gene simply drawing a stick figure with a turn at the end on a napkin. He saw this drawing and said, yes, it would be a great idea for my park to put that as a water slide for guests to enjoy. The thing is, as I said before, he didn't put many engineers to review things. Moreover, this attraction looked like it was from a cartoon. The best description given was that it seemed to be taken from the Looney Tunes, This person really believed that people were just going to go through that loop without any problem, because physics doesn't exist. Since they didn't like math in this park, they decided to do things by trial and error with dummies. They would throw dummies from the top of the slide and see how they came out. From there, they would make the corresponding improvements. The issue is that the first few times the dummies came out of this place, they came out without a head or other very important limbs. When they finally decided to test it on humans, they decided to pay people to go through it. There are those who remember Gene himself standing at the beginning or end of the slide with $100 in hand for anyone who wanted to try. And it was a complete disaster. The person who entered would go into a completely dark hole in which they couldn't see even a little bit of light. They only felt the water and suddenly felt how they started to fly and detach from the tube. That was the moment when most of the accidents occurred because most people would hit directly against the roof of that turn in the slide. So most people would come out of this place right into a pool that was too small with their faces all hurt. Because of this, it was decided to put some padding on the top to try to prevent accidents, but this didn't work. People kept getting hurt from this place, but then what was happening? It turns out that when they put that padding on the top, the first people would hit against it and leave their teeth stuck there. Their teeth would come out and stay there. So the next people in complete darkness would hit against that. They didn't know what it was, and they would come out all hurt, full of wounds all over their faces from teeth. Another one of the attractions that seemed to be taken out of a cartoon, not only for its unusualness but also for how it ends, is this one you see here. This slide that seems normal at first but ends in an unexpected way. It's like the previous one, people go into a slide that has no light, a hole with water, and they come out directly into the air. Normally people arrive without knowing what to expect. They thought it was a slide that ended directly in the lagoon, that is, they thought it cut off directly in the water. Nobody told them that the purpose of the slide was to be in the air for a while. So when people reached the end of the slide, they found themselves not knowing what was happening. They didn't know that there was water below them at first. They had come out of a hole without light, and most fell badly precisely because they didn't know what to expect, which caused quite a few accidents. Then there was another game that also had the purpose of you being in the air, but it was more obvious. You could see how the slide had small hills which people passed at a speed sufficient to make them fly. And the truth is that this game worked well for quite some time. It fulfilled its purpose. The people went over the hills, were in the air for a few seconds, went down, went up again. Everything seemed fine. Until suddenly a very fast kid arrived. A kid who was going at a much faster speed than everyone else. What ended up happening is that this kid went through the air at such a speed that he ended up far from the end of the slide. Therefore, he hit his face directly against the floor. But this is one of the accidents we're going to see today in this video. There were already some minor injuries on the slides, then this happened, which was precisely not calculated for all types of people, and then the things that I'm going to tell you now start to happen. One of my favorite attractions is this giant ball called the man inside the ball, within the ball. As its name suggests, it's a man inside a ball, which you can see here, that has little wheels to go on rails. The idea was precisely to build these rails that go down the mountain and thus have a super fun ride for the whole family. Additionally, it had windows, of course, to be able to see everything around. However, the rails were built with pipes that expanded with heat, and the park was designed mostly for those hot days. So, on the test day, as it was very hot, the person got inside the ball, and the ball caused the rails to collapse, fall, and end up on the highway. Because it should also be said that the park was divided into two large sections, divided by the highway so that people could arrive more easily, so the ball fell straight to that side, towards the cars. Clearly, this was another well-designed project. Anyway, there were many attractions, some more dangerous than others. The ones that stood out the most, however, were precisely the water ones, because this park wanted to be a water park. One particular attraction that brought quite a few problems was this one of jumping from a mini cliff into the water. The thing is that this place was not really an attraction, but rather a resting place, and therefore there was no one checking who could jump and who could not. There were no rules, therefore there were loads of people there all the time, and also there was no one controlling when they jumped. So what was happening was the following. There were a lot of people there were no indications that it was an attraction. So many fell accidentally because they didn't know there was water below, nor did they understand very well what was happening. And then there were those who jumped on top of the people who didn't understand what was happening. There were people below, there was no control, so they started to jump on top of other people, which caused many fractures. The worst part of all is that the person who was below was sinking. And the lifeguards who were nearby couldn't see them, which made the whole situation even more risky. This game resulted in many arm and leg fractures in particular, and obviously a few lawsuits. But this is the least of it, because people went to this place knowing it was dangerous and extreme. So even though there were some injured people, there were still interested tourists, there were locals who wanted to see what was going on. So beyond that, there started to be a few fatal accidents. First of all, we have another attraction similar to the one I already mentioned, which was a slide with jumps that had some boards, and like the others, it wasn't entirely well calculated. So at one point, a person went down this place, skidded, went off to the side, fell directly to the ground and broke their neck. There were also very poorly thought out attractions people would enter. There were too many. A person would stand up, hit their head against some piece of concrete, so the rest of the people would also stop so abruptly that they would hit themselves against other dangerous areas of the attractions. And precisely the most exaggerated ones were the ones that had rubber boats. In this type of attractions, they would let a lot of people pass without any care for the number of people there were. In addition, I must also say, I add here, that most of the park was being controlled by teenagers. The attractions were being watched over only by them. People who probably had no kind of experience controlling other people, nor much experience in what security was. So their job was basically to count to 5 and let another person pass. That's how the next big idea emerges. Imitate a rapid water journey. Strong currents, rocky formations, confusing paths. This is another attraction that had to be set aside for a while because people were coming out of there fainting or almost fainting. They had to lower the intensity quite a bit in order to let other people pass, but it still looked as if someone was going to fly out. And the interesting part of this game once it was remodeled was that people would gather outside the attraction to watch those inside lose control. They say there was a particular point where it seemed like the boats would really fly out. On top of the chaos from the lack of control, they also sold alcohol to anyone. There was no control over that. Teenagers could order without any kind of problem, and sometimes even children. That is, this park was full of completely drunk teenagers without any rules or adults who could control them, combined on top with the number of events this place had, such as its own Oktoberfest. A complete chaos. Among the most dangerous things was also Motor World, which had some things like go-karts, boats, motorized rubber boats, all those kinds of games that also turned out very badly. First of all, the go-karts, these cars that went fast. In this particular park, you could arrange for them to go even faster than allowed. You could tinker with it a bit. You could do some things that would make the engine have no limits. So obviously there were several crashes, and you also had to take into account 2 other things. The first one, people used the go-karts as if they were bumper cars, which they obviously weren't. And also next to this attraction, there was a beer stand, so people would come out of there, go play with the cars, and end up crashing. There were also boats that would often flip over because people used them like bumper cars, and these boats and motorboats were on a lake with snakes. So the employees of the place who were there controlling the situation as much as they could would stand at these attractions for a while and not only see boats flipping over but also see black snakes slithering into the grass. Another game in this section were the tanks that shot tennis balls. The instructions were simple: throw tennis balls at the other tanks to win. The problem is that when they broke, the tanks kept shooting balls, which made it quite impossible for the instructors to get to the tanks to fix them or stop them. But one of the most dangerous was undoubtedly the Alpine slide. Not only was it unsafe from the start, from its structure, but there were also external problems that they simply did not want to solve. This attraction was paths down which you went with a board. on which you could control how fast or slow you wanted to go. There were quite a few things wrong with this one, starting with the material. It was mostly concrete. What does this mean? It was people throwing themselves without any protection, almost without clothes, because they came from a water park with exposed skin, and on top of that, they could control just how fast they wanted to go. So obviously this caused quite a few injuries. When people fell and hit the concrete directly, their skin was practically raw. At that time, they went to one of the emergency rooms located in the park. The problem is that it wasn't certified people on site, but other teenagers with disinfectant sprays. The disinfectant against these raw wounds was not a good combination. Imagine that in these mini health cabins, there was a circle marked on the floor where if you stood still while they put the disinfectant on you, you won a prize. Because no one could stand still. Literally, no one could stand for 2 minutes while their arm was being disinfected. In fact, some people preferred getting infected over experiencing that again. I don't exactly know what these disinfectants had, but they weren't very careful about what they put on people as long as it prevented an infection. The way the ride was made and how the people who got on handled it, it was normal for the cars to flip over or to be directly thrown out. In addition, above these paths, there was a ski lift. People who wanted to go up the alpine slide had to go through this ski lift to be able to climb to the top and slide down. The problem was that people would sometimes go up with the carts, and therefore it often happened that they would fall on top of the people coming down. Whether it was on purpose or an accident, people would throw the carts directly onto the path where others were coming down, which is extremely dangerous. Building directly on top of another attraction is extremely dangerous, but they didn't care. Because of all these things, the park had injuries every day, and that's when we started with the most fatal accidents, those that made the news. One of these accidents was the kayak experience. This was a game in which people would get on their kayak and go on a kind of rapid currents. Under the water, to create this experience, there were some electric fans. So one day, a person was playing when suddenly their kayak flipped over and hit one of these fans, causing a short circuit and electrocuting them. After this, there were also accidents at the wave pool. And I say accidents because they happened more than once, but the first one occurred when a person drowned in the depths of this attraction. You may wonder why. Turns out it was a large pool with uncontrolled automatic waves. The waves were unpredictable, they reached up to 3 meters, and there were loads of people in there. Again, there was no one who could limit how many people were in there. So people just went in, and if something happened, no one could see anything because the water was extremely dirty. It wasn't just the people who brought mud from the rest of the park or the people who got in without taking a quick shower, but also the wounds contributed to the dirtiness. What was left of people's wounds were so many wounds that all the pus, all the blood stayed in the water, which made it impossible for lifeguards to see if a person was drowning, and that's what happened. But all in all, the one I consider the worst is the first of all the fatalities in the park, and it's the one that occurred on the alpine slide. A man was going down the path with his cart. It's not exactly known what he wanted to do, whether he wanted to go faster, whether he wanted to go slower. In fact, there were signs all along the route indicating where to go slower and faster, but what happened is that suddenly the cart detached from the path and went to the side. He flew out and the person hit directly against some rocks that were next to the attraction. The reason for the rocks being there is unknown. In fact, it's one of the first things that should be done when creating that type of attractions, because precisely if the rocks hadn't been there, this wouldn't have happened. Obviously, the family was very worried and they also wanted some response from the park. Not even initially compensation for all the medical expenses, because the young man was in a coma for a few days before he died, but they also perhaps wanted a bit of recognition from the owner. They wanted him to at least come forward to apologize or explain the situation, to want to improve it, but Shin never showed up. He never said anything about the case whatsoever, indicating that he had some responsibility. On top of everything, the company's delegate who spoke to the press told them that it wasn't the game's fault, but it was the rocks' fault. Which doesn't matter because the rocks were there anyway. But their reasoning was that then the game was safe and that nothing happened despite it not being the first time someone had fallen. But besides John, the owner of this whole place had a fake insurer in the Cayman Islands. If you don't know the term Panama Papers, I'll leave the name here for you to look it up on the internet. There's a very good documentary where it's explained like a movie with different situations from different families, how this affected all these people. And part of the Panama Papers was precisely this thing about having fake insurers, which made companies not have to pay almost anything or directly nothing, and people were the only ones harmed. If they had relatives who died because of a company, it didn't matter because they weren't going to get anything. It's a very interesting topic, but also very difficult to explain in these types of videos. So, go watch that documentary or simply look it up on the internet again. It's something that affected many people and therefore you should know about it. What you need to know is that not only were the families not given compensation, but they also directly did nothing to fix things. They were asked more than once to remove the rocks from that place to prevent more accidents. They didn't do it and it didn't affect the park. The rocks weren't a very important decoration. They didn't affect anything. In fact, they provided more security and they didn't want to do it. People really didn't care. Over time and with a lot of effort, this boy's family received a compensation of $100,000. But it was after many legal processes, and they also had to go through other fatal cases for them to be given attention. Otherwise, they probably would have ended up like the rest of the cases the park had because there were many harmful injuries. In fact, there was an attraction that every so often caused people to become paralyzed. This game caused people to hit a crucial part of their neck every so often, resulting in paralysis from the neck down. On these occasions, all Shin did was face the families, that is, carry out the trial. He didn't want to settle anything before the trial. He wanted to go to trial and thus be able to destroy the families because he obviously had more money and could pay for lawyers to defend him. There were a few times when he actually lost the trial. Because of all this, the park's fame was gradually declining. People saw the cases that were extremely serious and they no longer wanted to approach. They didn't take their children, they simply didn't want to go. Obviously, there was also the problem that this park gave money to the people who lived nearby. It was a great source of income for teenagers, for adults, for everyone. So there were several problems with these people who didn't want the park to go away. But the fame of this place decayed a lot. In addition, the lawsuits caused Action Park and its sister locations to have to close. First, the other locations that had opened, and then finally, Action Park declared bankruptcy. That's why in 1996, Action Park officially closed its doors. One day, Shin died and things were left to his son. What's surprising is that 2 years before this happened, Jin decided to gather some investors and reclaim the park. Obviously, he couldn't do anything, but his son tried to focus on reopening it in a different, somewhat safer way. Right now, the park has different maintenance, different management, and they are looking to reopen it with the appropriate safety measures. For example, they wanted to try the slide with the loop at the end, bigger, safer, with a different kind of mechanism so people don't hit their heads on the top part. But in reality, this attraction hasn't come out yet and it's unknown if it will. The park reopened as Action Park in 2014, but after a while of testing the name, it was decided to give it another one due to the bad reputation it already had. They didn't want the new park to be tarnished by these previous incidents. Right now, the park is open as if it were just a water park, and with limited capacity precisely because of everything that is happening in the world. Beyond all of this that I've told you, this is one of the parks that carries the most nostalgia because during the years it was active, it was extremely well known, very visited, and there were many people who didn't mind getting hurt. They really wanted to experience all that extremism. But there were also tourist people who came thinking it was a very fun park and that it was simply a family attraction when in reality it wasn't, and they ended up getting hurt. Therefore, there are other people who think that this park should never have reopened and prefer that it be forgotten. But well, tell me, did any of you visit this park in your adolescence? I know that people in their 20s and even up to 40 are watching me. And people who live in the United States, so tell me if you ever passed by there, if you know it, or if a family member maybe visited this place. I know that you sometimes have very interesting stories, so you can leave it below in the comments. But well, without anything else to say, here we end with the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Here are my Patreons and channel members. Behind me is my cat curled up as always because evidently she likes to hear me talk. Yes, no, she's super asleep, so well, here you have a new video. Here you have a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.